First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak here today. My interest in the RIC goes back on account of my father. He was 75 when I was born. He was 79 when my brother was born. He stopped there. I usually make the joke, I used to say to my mother is that I remember 9 months before I was born. My father said to my mother, "Do you want to go to sleep or what?" And she said, "What?" My father emigrated to Boston, was born in 1879. And I used to get into trouble in school over him. I was asked to do a composition, "What did your father do in the war?" So I went home and I asked him. I wrote 20 pages and I got a clatter off the teacher. He said, "You're a war out. Everybody else is talking about the Second World War." When I went into the next class then, the same thing happened all over again, but differently this time. Everybody was to stand up and asked, "What does your father do?" Came to me anyway, everybody was giving me every sort of occupation. I said, "He's retired." "No, but tell us more. What does he do all day?" I said, "Sleep," and I got another clatter. So it started from there, and it really started then. Halpin just mentioned a while ago, it's with a memorial, ultimately is dealing with death. And the death of 640 policemen is who we're hoping to commemorate. I've been corresponding with numerous RIC families, like an agony aunt to the RIC, and getting the story. We've solved loads of murders because people have admitted murders in various ways, and if there is this thing wanting to get off their chest, we've had it from both sides. But with all the other police forces that I just briefly mentioned, there are no memorials. There are 2 in the United Kingdom, 2 in London. I'll explain all about those. And the Harp Society was born out of a simple message. It was the 90th anniversary, 2012, when 2 retired inspector and retired guard, went up to Glasnevin and formed a group and went to a plot above there where some of the RIC men, some casualties were on that, and they decided to mark the occasion of the 90th disbandment of the RIC, which was the 31st of August 1922. And from that, they formed a committee, first of all called the RIC, and DMP brought them into it also. And the Harp Society was born, and what we've been doing since is we're having interdenominational service in Dublin on usually as close as possible to 31st of August. It's now moved to the 14th of September on account of all these All-Irelands. We just picked the RIC picked a bad time to disband. So we put a blame back in them anyway. Now, I was fortunate enough to meet an RIC man, and I'll explain about him with a sense of humour, which I was never told. I remember 1966, the 50th anniversary. I got the proclamation off my heart. In 1969, I was asked, "What proclamation?" We had a school reunion there recently, and he said, "You think you've had it bad?" He said, "I was in the hurling team." He said, "Brother Conlett marched us with hurleys down to the Republican plot," he said. So that's the other side of it. My father was a tailor and my grandfather was born in 1857. My great-grandfather was born in 1823, and the other was 1800. They were all tailors. And my father was a military tailor also. I made uniforms for the RIC. His brother, I was lucky enough, kept some records. He was brilliant at making his women's clothes. Not to be warm or anything like that, but the patterns used to come in from the UK, and the local gentry would have these, like Hello magazines now wanted this made, and he was simply brilliant at doing it. Now, my father left me this tin box under, but he emigrated to Boston in 1898. His first cousin married the mayor of Boston, James Michael Curley. She was his first wife. Her brother died the same day. Just by coincidence, Bishop Herlihy of Ferns, his brother died the same day as him. My father had 2 brothers who died of viral meningitis the same day, so I'm watching what my brother's eating at the moment. As I said, he emigrated with 5 sisters and a brother. I have now 112 cousins in the state of Massachusetts. I had my DNA done only recently, and last week a person in the same office as me said, "You're my 5th cousin, and I have 2 more RIC men for you." One of them ends up as a casualty I've actually written about. Constable O'Donoghue was shot in Cork the same night as Thomas Mccarthy in a reprisal. And the other is an RIC man who joined the Guards as a chief superintendent. I did 9 interviews to be sergeant, I failed every time, but this guy walks in and becomes a chief because he was connected to Michael Collins at the time. And in fact, the first formative committee were mostly RIC men and some DMP men, picked by Collins. There's letters in the Gallery Museum inviting them to form this new force. My father came back in 1915 to Ireland, straight to Liverpool, joined the British Army, ended up in the Battle of the Somme. I got a photograph of him in the Cork Examiner at the time. And he always said to me, if you were ever in Liverpool, he said, I knew they were going to win the war, he said, because when I left from Liverpool, he said, I looked back, there was 2 skyscrapers. When I came back, he said, there was 3 of them there. He said, and the Brits don't build skyscrapers for nothing. I did a selfie 100 years to the day on the exact same spot. Some things I lost out, my father, but I was lucky enough to get the detail. And my first introduction to a police station, I'll just show you in 2 seconds. It's when I got my parcel, Christmas parcel. My father brought me into Days in Cork, if anybody here remembers it. I ran out the back door and lighted my parcel. And if you're familiar with the geography inside in Cork City, there's the North Cape Bridge and the South Cape Bridge. We lived up in Bandon Road. Of course, I went up the north side, picked up by the police and brought in. My father eventually found me. I'm inside, sitting up on a stool with lemonade and biscuits, and that was my first vision of a former RAC station, Shandon Station. In 1961, I probably one of the best and most informed days of my life. My father brought me back out to Carrigadruchid, where they had a tailoring business. And in 1920, that station was attacked. And the story about it was that the RAC were so cocky about getting out that some guy started playing the fiddle inside, and one headline was "The Fiddler That Beat Sinn Féin." I've since got a photograph of the guy actually playing the fiddle. So it just, I never say no when it comes to finding records. There's ways and means of getting them. But I always wanted to find out who was in it. Now, he was making uniforms that week, and he was helping them making a hole into the house next door. I interviewed a lady who was a child at the time, only died in the last 10 years, to great age, and she named all the RAC men that were there at the time. I eventually got their records, but it took me so long to find out what the records were. I actually stopped a Mormon in the street in Cork when I found they had their records, normally the other way around. And I then made efforts to try and get, just even logistics, how times have changed. You can do everything on an app now. That time there was no apps. I went up, I remember having a laptop going up to Dublin, and the batteries wouldn't last from the amount of information I'd got in Dublin come down. Eventually, I found out where there's microfilm records. Eventually, when I saw the original records, there was more that I had missed because some of it was in colour. So eventually, I came to write a book on the RAC. I dedicated to the RAC when I met, including his story, and I just mentioned briefly about him. An amazing, amazing character altogether. I learned so much from that man. And a witness to history. He was one of 12 out of 85,028 alive at the time. On the same day, my father brought me out to another house, one of the big houses. On the way in, I knew he got this bottle, came away with a bottle of smoky kind of atmosphere. It was a bottle of pochino, I know what it was. So he went up to the big house, and I'll never forget the gentleman inside. He went up to measure him as one of his last uniforms. Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wert, VC. He retired to Ahina, won the Victoria Cross at the Somme. He left his final uniforms to my father. I was what I called a Downton Abbey one, the mess dress of his tropical dress. He was in 3 different, he was in the Boer War, World War I and World War II. He had 23 miniature decorations. He had a second set of decorations that my father used for on his uniforms. I have all that in the trunk that my father left me. The other thing about it is the cousins in America just keep writing. And the good thing about it is that my father knew them and knew all about them. And the biggest disappointment for me when I went to America and went to meet them in later life, I was totally disappointed. They all had aged, something I never bargained for, with all these photographs. Another turn of fate was that one of my aunts in Boston married a John Sullivan. And what would happen was we had cousins coming all the time. We knew they were coming because we got coffee, we got brill cream, and this haircut. And they were arrived. Now, they'd send us clothes at Christmas that they bought Macy's on the sale, we know now. We'd end up wearing them during the summer, and they'd photograph us with colour photographs and send on the photographs. So we're wearing American clothes, where you think was in America we were at the time. All that went on, but the thing about it, and another coincidence where another RAC connection, is one, the Sullivan, my aunt who married this John Sullivan in Boston, were always talking about the quiet man. And they were saying, we're going up to Galway and this type of, and I thought it was just a tall order more American speak. It now turns out that Tobias O'Sullivan, who's the subject of that book, Wound, is the first cousin. He got killed in the stall. He's connected to us. The Quiet Man was made on their land. On my mother's side, the manager of Ashford Castle at the time was on the Harold side and my Church of Ireland side. And Evine O'Sullivan was of the same family, Ryan Tubby's ex, I mentioned. And I didn't know this for years anyway, so I just give a start. I've quite a lot. It's just to show you much about what we've done so far, literally on a whisper and on some commemorations, some inventive ones, and some ideas for the future based on some of the ones we've been doing. Just a quotation I came across about that is David Eagleman said, there are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. And the third is that monument sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the last time. So you wait in this lobby until the third death. So the third death of the 640 members of the RIC who died violently in the line of duty can be prevented by the provision of a memorial to them. Now, just brief on, obviously, the Wikipedia version of history. We the Baronial Constabulary, the Peace Preservation Force, the Irish Constabulary, or the County Constabulary, then the Irish Constabulary, and they get the title Royal 1867 for suppressing the Fenian Rising. And there's other little police forces. The Dublin Metropolitan Police. The Dublin Police first becomes the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The Irish Revenue Police, the Puccine Hussars, 2,500 men chasing poachine makers over 25 years. I found their records, 598 of them transferred to the RIC. The Belfast City Police, known as the Bulkies, they were incorporated into the RIC. Derry City Police also, with other names, joined 1870. The Royal Irish Constabulary Auxiliary Force. I'm absolutely convinced that this is the blueprint for the Black and Tans. The reason being is that 440 of them were recruited from Ireland, England, Wales and Scotland. A circular was sent out to all different county constabularies. Those that were trained in use of firearms enlisted. They occupied the huts and they relieved the RIC. In County Mayo there was 26 huts when they arrived. There was only 2 at the end of the day. You had 440 equivalent RIC men out doing their duty with these replacing. And this also happened. They were trained in the Curragh. The first Tans that arrived were trained in the Curragh. They brought in the system of command, they changed it. From the financial side of it, they stood down one of the Deputy Inspector Generals and they brought in the Undersecretary for Police and Crime to control everything at the time. Then you have Railway Police, you have the CIE Police, the Irish Harbour Police. Oriel House Detectives, Michael Collins had his own police force based in Oriel House, broken into 2 groups, the detectives and also the Oriel House Detectives, and they had the others who were minding, once the treaty was signed, to protect the members of Dáil Éireann at the time. I've copied all of their paper. They're a fascinating outfit. They had all American cars and a huge inventory of them. There's Arthur Griffith's funeral passes Oriel House, and you can see a few of them. It's the only photographs that exist. They're actually on the roof at the time. And in Cork, during the War of Independence, Cork City had its own police force, the business interests in Cork, because the Guards were formed in February of 1922, but they didn't come down to Cork on account of the situation in Cork, so they formed the Cork City Police Force. And they actually, I have some of their first cases, they went to court at the time, and some of them were integrated into the Guards. And if you look at the photographs in Cork City, Michael Collins' funeral coming through, you'll see they have IRP up here. And then you have the Garda Síochána was formed in February 1922. The Royal Ulster Constabulary is formed on the 1st of June 1922, and which comes to Police Service of Northern Ireland. About 1,350 ex-RIC men went north. 860 went to Palestine. That list finished, and that was auxiliaries, Black and Tans, all went out there. Now this is the first Chief of Police in the Peace Preservation Force. Has a very interesting epitaph, he says. Epitaphs and tombs are monies vainly spent. A man's good name is his own monument. It says a lot in that, whatever about the individual that's on it. And when it comes to RIC identifying with Tans on a particular memorial, it's at the end of the day, people can make up their own minds what's behind it. This is my first version of an RIC. I didn't wear women's clothes at the time, but that's what my memory is close to that when I was about 4 years of age. This is my father. He's just touching, this is 1979, just about 80. That's myself and my younger brother. He ended up in the Guards also. In fact, my brother went down to join the Guards and his chest was too small, and I filled out the paperwork and I got through, and I had no intentions of... the reason being is that I didn't think I'd get in medically, because Ewan Halpin was talking with use of firearms and the amount of RIC and people that were killed. I was actually got shot. I got a bullet through both legs, a .303 rifle when I was 16, doing guard duty out in the Scarradam. The trouble broke. I was underage. It was supposed to be 17 to join. The fellow that shot me was also 16. I'm a pensioner since I was 17. I'm 48 years a pensioner, but the RIC when I met has beat me to it. He was 74 years a pensioner when he retired. And there's a funny aspect to that too, because I used to go up every year to Dublin for a medical, the Army Pension Board, and they gave me this docket with the FF up on top of it. And I went to the main hospital and there was a pensioners wing. The first few years I went up, old IRA, in about 10 years, numbers were getting smaller. In fact, General Sean McKeown died in the room next to me, I think 73 or 75. But you man wouldn't believe me, 5 years in a row, the fellow at reception. He'd knocked out the APP, you couldn't be, he says. I went in, the doctor would blow a fuse in the morning when they came around. They gave me the striped pyjamas and the usual thing, and came around, the nurse taking your temperature and blow a fuse. The board had to sit again. This went on for 5 years now until they made it permanent. That's my father in Boston. His biggest claim to fame when he was in Boston, on account of having the political connection, was that he sewed the buttons in the waistcoat of the then President William Howard Taft. I looked up Google that time, which was like Encyclopedia Britannica, just to see it in 1915. He was there. In fact, his grandson was the British ambassador to Ireland in the 1950s, and my father met him in Blarney at a Toastal. Now, my father's brother was also got the same job, but in order two of them could say they did it, they picked every second button. That's the photograph. I nearly fell off the chair. I was looking up somebody else. That's my father, actually. In the Royal Field Artillery. I have his cap badge, I have his lanyard, I have his discharge papers, his medals, and there are his discharge papers. He lied about his age, but he spent 1 year, 314 days in France. He made uniforms for Captain John Coulter's, Bowen Coulter's, the man that shot Cheese Geffington. He also lived, his family on Carrigan Road. One of his daughters lived to be 100. The second family, I was only on to her yesterday. She still lives there. He was found guilty but insane, sent off to Canada, got several thousand acres over there, and now she's a teacher in Seattle and Washington. And this is one of the dress, my father, one of the uniforms that he sent on to him later on. And that's his brother, Bowen Coulter's. We have Robert, he was in Dublin Castle. I have bits and pieces of his uniform too. He didn't last too long. He was over 6 feet in the trenches. So 32 when he was killed. That's the general. What I remember most about that day was Lady Duarte and in this big house for the first time. And there was a scullery maid and a parlour maid. And my father went off with the general. He was in a wheelchair and he was measuring up for his last uniforms. But Lady Duarte says to me, "You're not eating your sandwiches." There was triangular sandwiches on 3 different levels, and I said I was afraid to pull them before the whole thing come crashing down. That's the uniform as it is, as I have it today, and actually that's the Sam Brown belt that he wore at the Somme when he won the Victoria Cross. That's what I call the Downton Abbey uniform, the mess dress one, and that's his tropical dress. He ended. Outside of all these injuries he got, he walked out of a restaurant in Cairo and the roof caved in. He fell down, he broke his back when he was in China, and he had crash landed a plane, another few small kind of minor things like that. And that's him there talking about names. You can see him at the back, with his arm was missing, his eye was shot out of his head. My father said it was the best job he ever got because he said it was the least material with the most money. And you can see he's next to Mountbatten, and actually Mountbatten's, it's amazing. With all my chasing and going looking for records and this type of thing, Mountbatten figures in it, or the Mountbatten family figures in it. And it's only recently when we were making petition to government to look for a police memorial, all that I've been chasing over the years just came out literally by the strangest of coincidences. This is the RIC station in 1910. That's in Carrigadrohid. This is after the attack. This is Sergeant Root, and William Root, he got the Constabulary medal, and also another 8 constables got it for defending the station at the time. The photograph was actually taken in Barnsley in England in 1924, and that's the last tailored uniform that my father made for him. This is the photograph I was telling you about. You can see the fellow playing the fiddle outside the station just after the attack. Now, this is where the Mountbatten connection, his father-in-law, Colonel Wilfred Ashley, asked the question what was being done about the attack on the barracks in Carrigadrohid in a parliamentary question. And they said that they would be decorating this type of thing. So then he has several questions at the time, but the very fact that he also, you'll see just in a few minutes, this is Blarney Station. I joined the Garda Síochána in 1977, and you know helping saying you can be lucky where you get stationed. I ended up in Hackballs Cross, and it was like Disney World at the time. We got shot at the first week above there, and when you're just out of Templemore, from the police perspective, and all policemen will say to you, you're trying to interpret the lectures as to what you'll do with your wary reports of arrest and this type of thing. And of course, there's always some joker in the back of the car. They were only too delighted new guy was getting in because he was getting all their paper. So we were in this patrol car with the first drunk driver, came up to a V in the road. This guy missed a V, ran up a tree, drinking a bottle of whiskey. I said, what lecture, what section I arrested him under? The man said, the Forestry Act 1946, he said. he said, felling a tree without a license during darkness. He said there could be a health and safety issue there too. So gladly I came back to Blarney. I spent about 30 years in Blarney. The fun side of that was that the Americans come in every day of the week telling us about how many guns they had and this type of thing. And one fellow was sick on Monday. He said, why don't you carry guns? And the man said, they're too heavy. So we decided to, at the time, I got a copy of the Garda Commissioner's signature, and we made out this little card. We told me the secret weapon. And I went in, put on my tunic, and I showed him the instructions anyway. And he said, what's the weapon? I said, it's a whistle. And the instructions on it were, if you see a felon escaping from the scene of a crime, you blow the whistle and you shout, stop. So he said, what if he keeps going? I said, see the instructions on the other side. Stop or I'll blow again. No. The reason I'm saying about logistics is when I was looking at records 100 years ago, the logistics for policemen to arrest somebody. For example, Tower, which was out the road, about 3 miles out the road, they got a call. By the time they get it, was like the Wild West, probably 2 days later, that there was a burglary outside there. Some guy heads out on his bike to investigate it. He finds the prisoner. And he said, I'm arresting you. Come on. He said, how could he get back to the station on a bike? You know, it's like the logistics of whatever about movement and that type of thing. Simple things like that. Now, Blarney Station was attacked the same week as Carrigadrohid Station was attacked. And that's what was left of it. What actually happened was the Irene side in Cork stole cars at 15-minute intervals, formed a convoy, cut down trees behind the convoy, had a van, put explosives into it, loaded it into the hotel, put it up the chimney. It actually doubled back to nearly leveled the hotel and just underneath a piece of the wall. Now, they put one fella in anyway. The RIC ran out the back. They pushed in this fella. He was known as Tiny afterwards. He's the only guy who fit in the hole. But the fun part of it was, for me, was this is Sergeant Matthew Larkin. He's the last sergeant that was in the place at the time. When I heard the story, I tracked down his daughter, who's 93, and I walked her in through the station and taped her, describing every room as it was. They ended up using it in Michael Collins' film, in The Window Shakes the Barley. We got a house down in Mallow. But on the other side of the coin, again, this ends up as a parliament, all about what about Mrs. Larkin, how was she looked after, and this type of thing, again by Lord Ashley. Now, this is the man who attacked the station. In 1965, he called into the station and he said, I was involved in the attack, and he said, I know where the clock is, he said. Tiny robbed the clock, he says, like that, and I know where it is. So he said, you want it back? So he met the detective 2 days later, handed back the clock, the clock hanging in the station. Now, it brought home to me afterwards when I looked up where he's buried and where Sergeant Larkin is buried. They were within 10 yards of one another in St. Minbar Cemetery. So I was saying, what's this all about? What difference does it make at the end of the day? As to further, or to get a memorial for the RIC, when the RIC was disbanded, the officers formed an association in London. They were lucky at the time in that two of the officers, high-ranking officers, one had become Commissioner of Police in London, another was in charge of regiment in London, and they had some bit of pull in getting it. So they was meeting this Frascati restaurant in London. So they decided to approach Westminster Cathedral, the Dean of Westminster Cathedral, and also eventually they got a memorial. But the interesting part for me was that it was the first cousin of General de Werth who was the Dean there at the time. And by the time the memorial went up, that's it in Westminster Cathedral. It's one of two memorials only to the RIC. There are none in this country. The next one, and that's Brigadier Byrne, who retired, was disbanded, or this man that you happened to mention was sacked, or just put on indefinite leave. He unveiled a memorial in 1939 in it. And they approached St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, the General's first cousin, they're his decorations. I'm looking for a photograph of him, but they were a very wealthy family. His brother was the Belgium at the time, and he started up a hospital in London, took a team over of doctors and nurses to help the Belgians and even the Germans, and came back, and any Belgians that were brought back to London, he done, and also put up a memorial to them, so they got the right guy at the right time. And the second memorial is in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, and that's the Monsignor that was there at that time. Now, this is the RIC that I met. I was on the radio looking for information, and this woman rang me. She says, I have a live one for you. And I said, what do you mean? She says, my grandfather's still alive. He was in the RIC. He was, I think, 98 at the time. So I went next train up to Dublin anyway. The house evacuated. They were hearing the stories from him for over the years, all off to Riverdance. I ran out of tape after 2 hours. But I learned so much in that 2 hours. Number one is you had to be 5'9" to join the RIC, but if your father was in it, you got an inch off the height. You had to be 19 to join, but if your father was in it, you got a year off the age. And he says, I know, I got in under both counts. You couldn't be stationed in your home county or your wife's county, and you were automatically transferred. You had to have 7 years service before you could get married. 7 year itch, I think is probably some people call it. But a great character altogether. I worked with the Arts Department in Michael Collins' film, and we went looking for him. He was on holidays, 99 years of age, and we couldn't find him. But the one thing he said to us about where the gun is going to be, and I said, they're just inside the door. And if you look at the Michael Collins film again, you see where it's a raid for arms, the same thing in the wind, the Shakes the Barley. He said we weren't that stupid. We had a gun in each room, he said, and the idea was that no matter what room they retreated, they were armed. Very practical situations. And he had a sense of humour, and the one story I always remember about, he said there was an unbelievable camaraderie in the RIC, that when he left the depot, his father was in it, his father-in-law was in it, and he had 3 brothers in the RIC. And they mixed in the same social circle. Another sister married an RIC man. But when he was being brought to a station, to Wicklow, on his way to another station in Wicklow, there was a sergeant there that knew his father. Look, he said, get out here. He said, this is a hand your station. No, I said, no, I'll stand on my own 2 feet. He says, I'll keep going. But he told me, he said, you being a policeman would probably appreciate this. He said, the marching, he said, you know when you're marching along, it's left, right, halt, he said. There was one always out of step, and it was left, right, halt, and then there was this other tap. So the drill instructor found out who it was anyway, and he eyeballed this friend. He said, take a pace forward, what's your name? Your man says, McGuinness. Well, McGuinness, he said, if you want a donkey to halt, he said, what do you say to him? What you say is, whoa. He says, stand back in there now. Thanks to our friend, Mr. McGuinness, we have new instructions. It'd be left, right, halt, whoa, McGuinness. one thing I learned for the first time about casualties, and some of the statements that he made to me at the time. He said some of his colleagues were shot at home at night, shot dead in ambushes by 3 men as he walked home on duty, fatally shot when ambushed while home on leave from the station, shot dead by 5 men in a car as he returned from shopping, shot dead as he was leaving his wife's home by a man on a bicycle, attacked walking home from a public house and dumped in a field, shot dead walking from home to the railway station in plain clothes, shot dead while at home in bed, having recently been disbanded. And the worst atrocity I see with these 2 policemen, 7 months after the truce, they were in hospital, both shot in their hospital beds. That's the worst side of things. As I said, I eventually dedicated a book to him, and at the same time I want to remember all those that were killed on duty at the time, and all those who had volunteered for World War I. 752 RAC men went off to the First World War. There was an Act of Parliament passed to cover the Dublin Metropolitan Police and the RAC, so they would be guaranteed their pension rights afterwards. 176 of them were killed, and there's I found all of the graves with the help of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I updated the book. I got so much correspondence from people as regards medals and that type of thing. The 3 royal visits. It reminded me when the Queen came here. I was on duty above in Dublin, and we were told to move out when she came off the M50. And there was a woman said to me, she said, "Gareth," she said, "would you move out the way when the Queen comes? I want to get a photograph." I said, "I'll do a better one." I said, "Give me your camera," and I took a photograph as she was passing. So I was giving this woman back the camera. She said, "One question can I ask?" And she said, "Well, did the Queen wave to you?" "No," I said, "but she sent me a text message." But she took off down the street altogether. The girl got a text message. Now, I got so much correspondence as a result of first there was only 2,000 people listening it, so eventually I covered the whole up to full 85,028. Every one of them can be found because it's different to ordinary genealogy. Once you have the person number, you have them for life and you can stick everything to it. There are 834 Murphys in the RAC, but you can pin down absolutely everyone, put them in a time frame, it's not over. And you can, I've done it with I've yet to find one that I can't find. So, of course, the officers then, there were 1,700 officers who would have recommended the same thing when a person joins the Guards at the moment. They go before the local district, the local sergeant, before the superintendent. They're the equivalents of superintendents and higher ranks also. And the beauty about it is, if you can trace where they are, civil registration began in this country on the 1st of January 1864. If a person joined in 1838 and an officer recommended him, you can go to his record, and the difference is they'll tell you where he was at the time, so you're down to a few parishes. And you can, the other difference then, of course, I still get correspondence even though all the RAC. So I found out another police force in Dublin, 12,556, and I got that list. The beauty of those records is that they also mention the parish that the person is from. Now, and what has superseded that now, with UCD, we've got the original records digitized. You can actually go up and look at the original record. When I say records, the full service records have not survived. It's only the registers. 4 sample files have survived, and they're in the Public Records Office in Kew. And then, of course, I found this other fellows chasing the poteen makers. They were in red in the registers. Only when I got to Kew and saw the original registers, I was looking at black and white microfilm, I was able to get the list from it. But they're a very interesting bunch. If you got married, you got sacked. It was that simple. And just only the last few months, there's the UK Roll of Remembrance, and it's every policeman killed since records began with policemen. But it also now including the RAC, the DMP, and the book's only launched recently, and the memorial book opened every day for all the UK police forces in Ireland up to 1922, and it'll include if an RAC DMP man was killed on a particular day. This is one, they all went off to colonies, and I found myself on a headstone out in an RAC man who actually went off. He's from Sneem in Kerry, and his wife was from Churchtown. The wife's sister also went over. Her husband died over and she came back. But the RAC set up practically every single police force in the colonies. They're the only cadet-trained police force from 1842. England, Hendon and all those are all 20th century. And another, all that's happening on Hong Kong at the moment. On the Hong Kong flag there's a flower called Bauhinia blakeiana, called after Henry Arthur Blake, an ex-RAC officer. buried down in Youghal under 4 yew trees planted by Sir Walter Raleigh. So they're still creating trouble around the world. This is an RIC man an officer who has the most memorials. He went to arrest the parish priest above in Donegal, that's in Southern Ireland, and he was literally stoned to death at the time. There's a beautiful silver bust of him in the PSI Museum. There's a memorial to him in St James's Cemetery in Dublin. He's not buried there. There's another memorial to the church outside which he's buried, and this is his grave. And the reason there's so much ornamental stuff, we found out that his relatives were silversmiths and stonemasons, and that's the reason he got all these memorials. These are the 2 men on the right-hand side who started off the Harp Society, and the other gentleman's from Northern Ireland. And as a result of starting the Harp Society, the stories we have, it's like history repeating itself, from RUC widows, is absolutely heartrending stuff. I can imagine what the RIC went through, the exact same thing as history repeating itself. When a memorial is going to exist, it would actually look something like that. And I agree with you on the Halton while ago to be very careful with the dates. And you can see an extra little line on the side I've included to make sure to get the statistics right. They all don't all die in ambushes. Some of them might live a few days, some might live in 6 months, or some might live a year afterwards. So with the date they were wounded and the year that they literally become a casualty. Bram Stoker's grandfather, Thomas Thornley, the mother's father, he was killed in 1849. He took him about nearly a year to die, and he'll be also on it. Now, how were they killed and where were they killed? On mobile patrols, there was 89, and with all these ambushes, including Kilmichael, Drumkeen, Rathmore, Glenwood, County Clare, Ballinderry, Roscommon, Ballinally, County Longford, Inches Cross, Tipperary. On cycle patrols, 111, 7 of them were cycling, going to court. On foot, walking to and from their barracks, attending church, 9, seeking the assistance of a priest, 2, seeking the assistance after a shooting incident, looking for help and got shot, returning from funerals of colleagues, preventing a burglary, and visiting a doctor. Then at the barracks on bomb and gun attacks, and others, the 70 that were assassinated were in shops, pubs, hotels, restaurants, on trains, on trams, in hospital, in clubs, in a cinema, with their wives, with their fiancés, with their sons, going to and from railway stations, attending a fire, going to a dance, at a race meeting, out driving with friends, 2 fishing and 1 swimming. And then on escort duty, the first 2, of course, in Sullihead Beg, guarding a land agent, and there was one in Limerick, escorting the mails or escorting a Sinn Féin march. And then 32 at home, 10 of which were retired, that were shot in retirement, including a father and son. Some of them were killed in accidents, on friendly fire, then coming up to a checkpoint and getting killed. 25 were abducted, 4 of which were abducted in retirement, and others then in searches, making arrests, the disturbance, and 1 was drowned. And as regards the ranks, when I say 614, go back to 1836, I have the breakdown next for War of Independence, but believe it or not, there is no rank of sergeant in the RIC before 1882. When you joined the RIC, you joined as a second-class sub-constable before 1882. If you kept your mouth shut and your head down, you went up to first class after a year, and then next rank was constable, head constable. After 1882, you joined as a constable, and then there was an acting sergeant, and then sergeant. There's the various ranks and nominations, 383 constables. You can see 7 sergeants were killed in retirement. 2 district inspectors, 1 county inspector retired. And you see the other ranks are their auxiliary division. Now the breakdown for the War of Independence, as I have it, is 541. And you can see it progressively gets worse there in 273. And in 92, even the 40 that were killed, even after the truce and after they were disbanded. And just by county, you can see 46 were from Cork that were killed. That's the most. The English then, 144 from England, 48 mostly from London. And you can see there's some of the auxiliaries, one from Australia, Canada, India. Not that he was Indian or anything like that. His father was serving the British Army in India when he was born, New Zealand. And this is the counties where the 640 members were killed. And again, Cork has the greater amount there, 112. Now, and this is by religion. 367 were Catholic, 227 Protestant. And we were lucky enough, we have a memorial already got up to the DMP in Kevin Street, the stationary for, that was their training depot. And the RAC were trained. And we've also, remember those that were passed through there and went off to the war. Now, with the RAC when they went off to the war, that's the full 176 that were killed. And there's the various regiments that they were in at the time. And that's the various amounts. And of the 176, 42 of them were sons of RAC men. And that's where they're in 86 cemeteries throughout. Now, this is a very poignant one in that you can see a lady carrying a child there. The man out the front, the officer out the front, is actually, that's her husband. He doesn't come home. That's him there. You saw with the sinking of the centenary came up recently of the Leinster. That's one that he was home on leave going back and he got killed. That's his photograph. This is a very poignant one in that with Dublin Metropolitan Police, the first policeman killed in 1916 at Dublin Castle, John O'Brien. We had a commemoration literally to the minute. And just as we were going away, this young girl came up with a bunch of flowers and wanted to put them down. And we asked her, how was she connected to John O'Brien, or James O'Brien? And she said, I'm not. She said, I'm connected to the man who killed him. And we were commemorating him, and just in a few minutes inside, he was shot in the City Hall. That's him there, with Abbey actor Sean Connolly. Countess Markfitz allegedly killed Michael Lehive. And the first person on the scene who literally saw him fall is Noel Purcell. I have it on a recording. He describes it. In fact, the street, Noel Purcell Street, is called roughly very near, actually, where the incident occurred. This is an interesting one in some bit of compromise when it comes to memorials. In 2016, we found his grave, and it was fairly black at the time, so he's the only casualty killed in the West, RAC in 1916. So with the politics above in Galway anyway, it was agreed that we get his headstone cleaned up and then all of a separate memorial at the ambush. But an interesting thing happened on the day. A friend of mine, John Duffy retired, he was in the Garda Museum. A friend of his came along. He'd been away to be a priest with him, and he said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Wasn't your grandfather in the RAC? Wasn't he in another part of the country?" He said, "Yeah, but I had two grandfathers." He said, "The other grandfather is the man who shot the policeman." So, and that's the compromise with the 1916, and you can see the memorial, and we later read there. Other different organisations have taken upon themselves, like Local History Society, and are still doing it. And those that were killed in Ashbourne, some of them buried above in Navan, they've undertaken this one. This is the one of John Herlihy. You can see they've added all the new information to the headstone in Bear. This is the most senior officer killed in 1916. Absolutely nothing done to commemorate him. Despite the fact he was one of the founders of Lucan Golf Club. He's only a stone throw from where I'm living, so we cleaned up the grave and we found this. His wife had died. She was only, she was only 26 years of age when she died. She died just about a week after this photograph was taken. That's her in the front there, and he's third from the right. And actually, that's her there putting on the green. This is the first officer that was targeted 100 years ago, and a few weeks ago we had a commemoration, and we got his headstone cleaned up. His grandnephew was the absolutely spitting image of them all together. Another district, the same man who shot him went on to shoot Inspector Wilson after District Inspector Wilson, and Wilson has a very simple epitaph. He said, his life to his country is soul to God. another commemoration, 100 years to the day, Dublin Metropolitan Policeman Inspector. He was sent out from Store Street. There was a proclaimed meeting at the time, and he was sent out. And so when he arrested Count Plunkett and the other speaker, and he was bringing to the station when he was struck with a Herlihy down the back of the head, and died later on that night. And I found his grave above Mount Jerome, and we got it cleaned up. His family had literally died out, but we tracked down a grandnephew. And 100 years to the day, to the minute, the gentleman on the left is his grandnephew. The man on the right is a nephew of the man that killed him. And the sinister part of it is that I have an admission to the murder on an application for a pension by the young fella that shot him, the 16-year-old. He ended up going off to Scotland, coming back, and he makes his application on Garda-headed notepaper. He'd been in the Guards at the time. He lately found to be insane and died. Another one very close to home, in fact, in Skibbereen, Constable Clark, Alexander Clark, Sandy Clark, hours before the truce was up. He was returning home, was shot dead outside his door. In 1929, his daughter spoke for the first time when she heard about the death of this other gentleman, who was then in the Guards. He was blown up above him in County Clare. She had actually witnessed it and mentioned his name for the first time in 1929, so just shows how complicated things can be. This is 2008. We got a group together down in Inchigeelagh, Sergeant Monsell. That's him there, and that's his grave in St. Finbar Cemetery. And the local parish took it upon themselves to get the families of the three that were involved in the shooting, the four memorial cards on the altar, and a grandson of one of the attackers said the Mass. So it just shows things can be done. This is a fairly inventive headstone. I think it's absolutely incredible in what's on it. There are members of the RIC, there are members of the IRA, and there are members of the British Army of the same parish went off, 1916, and I think it really should be a prototype, if it's done at parish level, to do the exact same thing. Now, this is the man who recruited all the Black and Tans at Corkman. He's this guy, he went over to London, Cyril Francis Fleming. He's the son of a district inspector, the grandson of the district inspector, or sub-inspector, who actually founded the Phoenix Park Depot. That's his father. He died out in St. Anne's Hill in the Hydro in Blarney. That's the grandfather. He's buried above Mount Jerome Cemetery. He was in the Rifle Brigade, ran away to war, joined the Rifle Brigade, and the RIC uniform is a rifle green. It's actually based on that regiment, the colour. This is just on the Black and Tans. This is a postcard I sent home in 1920 showing the different groupings between auxiliaries, Black and Tans, regular RIC. I prefer to call them British recruits, because the formula that you'll always read about is that the distinction between the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries is that the Black and Tans were temporary constables, the auxiliaries were temporary cadets. The Black and Tans were non-commissioned officers, the auxiliaries were commissioned officers. But the grouping can be subdivided. If you just take the ordinary way of recruiting, the way the local fellow from here, say, joined the RSC and joined from Ireland, the only recruiting from 1921 in England. So the recruits were temporary constables, only a group within that. They got 10 shillings a day. The auxiliaries got a pound a day, which went up to a guinea a day, all found. But the English recruits, other than those being temporary constables, ended up with a pension, whereas the temporary constables did not. They were so temporary that some of them never left the barracks anywhere. They were the Veterans and Drivers Division above in Gormanston, because if it was built the same, if the Black and Tans were to be used in the way they intention to do it, you had the auxiliaries being the officer corps of those. They were to work on intelligence and route the IRA and go chasing after them. But what happened was, in these roundups, they did some at the very start, but the intelligence dried up. So they had a motorised division here, and that's how they started chasing the flying colours then after all of that. There are the numbers, and you can see there's some percentage of Irish. I know all of the Irish guys at this stage. When I say Irish, they could be sons of British Army officers who were born in Ireland. But no, I have a book that they published. It just shows how cocky they were at the time. And this is how they describe themselves. That's how they start life of a cadet. That he starts off and he's born grousing. He became a Boy Scout, gets his first uniform. He joined the army and eventually obtained a commission, but he was demobbed. Then he took up pre-war position on the Corps. Then he became an auxiliary cadet, rising to the rank of acting section leader, unpaid. And with his gratuity from the RIC and being one of those lucky blighters, he managed, heaven knows how, to get his subsistence loans paid. He bought a coal mine during a strike. But after dodging Jerry's, Shinner's and income tax officials, he trips over the kiddie hoop and passes away. Now, they published that, the Bog Trotter Act. It's actually printed at gunpoint in Limerick. These are the Kilmichael, all those that were killed in Kilmichael. There's one poignant thing that in this, there's one temporary constable, he was the driver on the day. I noticed with a lot of the drivers were Irish. A very simple reason, they knew where they were going. Now, this is the man who escaped on the day, and he was, what they say, dispatched with shovels. He ended up in Anahalla Bog, and his body was dug up some years later. Now, his wife was expecting at the time, and she put this ad in the paper, in the Independent, Cecil, little Dorothy arrived today, just to see was he still alive. And this is the rector of the parish. You can see where he's accounted for in those. The same rector was actually there at the time later on. This is the man who survived completely. I tracked him out to Rhodesia in 1941. I got his army file, and he wasn't satisfied with £15,000 compensation. He ran into trouble with the taxman. He tried to attribute his injuries in Kilmichael to First World War injuries and get a disability pension. But the taxman came after him anyway, and he ended up going out. His sister had already married a policeman out in Rhodesia, ended up outside there. This is Philip St. John Howard Kelleher. He was shot up in Kitty Kieran's pub. But what's interesting about him was that he was only shot just before Kilmichael, and his father did the autopsies on those that were killed in Kilmichael. He's buried in Macroom. And actually his brother died there in the 1980s. He was a general, the doctor in the British Army. That's his grave. I think you have mentioned about one of these three this morning. But this is a photograph I got of a lady who's his granddaughter. His wife was expecting at the time, and he never knew the child was born, and she didn't know what happened to him in Ireland. But in fairness to General Sean McKeown, some of those that were wounded, he made sure that one of the trucks was commandeered, brought him to Dublin, but he actually died in Dublin shortly afterwards. This is two sides of the coin about an RA seaman, or we call him Black and Tan, was returning in Kerry, returning off leave, and he was killed. And the family made contact with me, and they gave me a letter that was sent by that sergeant on the right-hand side, and on receiving a report, and this is the way it's described, this killing, on receiving a report at 12:30 a.m. on Monday the 1st November 1920, the Constable Albert Frederick Casely, Royal Irish Constabulary, Killorglin, RIC Barracks, was lying dead on the road at Banshee, Killorglin. Sergeant James Collery and 9 constables visited the scene at 12:50 a.m. and found Constable Albert Casely lying on his face on the road. The constable was quite dead, and there was a large gunshot wound below and behind his left ear. There was blood oozing from the wound. Sergeant Collery, I went to look at his record. He was shot dead shortly afterwards himself, the man who made the report and the letter. That's his funeral in London. There's news footage that was used, Patty news footage that was used in the Michael Collins film, In the Wind That Shakes the Barley. and it's about the tan in the quadrangle in London with Lloyd George inspecting the auxiliaries and the black and tans. And the impression they used in the Michael Collins film was to say that these guys are coming over to rout the IRA. In fact, when you look at the film, I have one person whose grandfather was in that grouping, and what actually happened was they were over for the funeral of this man that was killed, and it was actually in reverse that they happened to be in London at the time, and it was a photo op for the Prime Minister to go in to do it, so just don't believe all you see. This man's wife, he was shot dead above in Targil on the orders of Collins. Professor Lee Wilson. It's his widow is Dr. Wilson, who the famous Caravaggio painting. And there's two Harry Clock windows dedicated to him above in Gorey. The Sergeant Smith, who at this time 100 years ago was lingering, having been shot and died in September 1919. That's his grave. Just next Saturday, even though his centenary is not coming up until October, next Saturday there's commemoration at his gravesite. And that's just in the local papers, you can see in it, and that's the date 3rd. Now, the Heritage Group above in Cloughjordan were looking for seeking relatives of two RIC men that were kidnapped, and they were buried in the bog. And the local curate at the time, who was in the place, came back as parish priest years later, and they recovered the bodies and they were repatriated to the families. One was sent up to County Meath in Enfield, and the other was buried locally, and the locals have got together, and they're actually putting up a headstone to him. I found out that he had a brother in the RIC, and it was through him we've recently tracked down relatives, and they're coming to the event, but with both families going. That's Corny Crean, Tom Crean's brother. That's his grave there in St. Finbar Cemetery. I had a phone call from a man. When I was in the Cardiff station, some people thought it was the old RIC station, because I'd often get calls in the patrol car, go back to the station, there's someone ringing about the RIC again. And this man rang one night whispering over the phone, and he was in Upton, his father was the station master, and he remembers some of the attackers putting the gun to his father's head, and he just had to literally get off his chest. My daughter being quick, he said, I just have to tell you this, he says, like that, and names the attackers at the time. It transpires that the information was right, but this man kept it the whole time. This is Inspector Wilson. He's the second district inspector that was killed by the same man as Inspector Hunt. And that's his headstone. All his family ended up going to America. This man here, Patrick Perry, Roland Dare Collette in the Late Show, Collette Farmer, who married Donald Farmer. That's her grandfather. I found out who killed him, and they got out under the truce, but he married a local teacher, and of course, as soon as they got married, got transferred. But she said, would you ever try and find out that side of the family? I happened to be above in Sligo, so I went up anyway, and I found the house they came out of, and the guy in the house, he was collect greyhounds and Volkswagen Beetle cars, and they had the dogs inside in the cars anyway, and I said, geez, you fierce rich cousins up here, even the dogs have cars. This is a man whose body was never recovered. He's from the from Spiddle. Sean O'Tourich to North, he's his granduncle. He's supposed to have gone into the furnace in Tralee, but his father was able to get him declared officially dead for probate purposes. And this is the connection I mentioned earlier on about Tobias O'Sullivan. It's his first cousin, my grand-aunt. Now, the two children that are there, two sons, he was with his son in Listowel. He'd survived Kilmallock, the attack in Kilmallock, got promoted district inspector, got a Constabulary medal, and he'd just come out of the sweet shop in Listowel, and he was riddled. His son was with him at the time, and that's the book that was mentioned this morning. That's all about the background to it and the fallout of it. And when I was doing the officer's book, I found his grave above, and Glasnevin just happened to put a flower on it, but came back shortly later, and shortly afterwards, and someone had done up the headstone. Don't know who has done it up. There's also video footage, or not what I say, film footage of the funeral. Now, the Maureen O'Hara, the stand-in for Maureen O'Hara, that's her there on the left, married his son. And this is one of my new ancestors. I'm only after finding out through DNA in the last few days. And actually, the fellow in the office with me, actually, about 10 years ago, actually sent me photographs of him. So I ended up being cousins. And this is my other relative, I'm after finding out, the man on the left-hand side with Michael Staines. Actually, Michael Staines' father was also an RIC man. Edward Staines, going into Dublin Castle, and that's him there to start, ex-RIC man. This is District Inspector that was out, Harry Biggs, with his fiancée, and she was in the car with him, and they were both shot. Michael Keeney, who was in, he got decorated for the Burgate ambush. He was transferred into Tuckey Street in Cork, and he came back out here to collect his furniture, and he was shot. He was with his son at the time. His son was wounded. He's buried in St Finbar Cemetery. The son died shortly afterwards, and his wife died within a year. But the other son moved to London, ended up in the British Army, ended up in the SAS, parachuted in World War II in behind enemy lines and was shot dead by the SS, and there's a huge monument to him in Italy. That's his grave there in the Finbar Cemetery. And that's the son's grave. And this is another couple returning from a tennis match, District Inspector, and they were both shot. Now, the question, what have the got in common? Tom Barry, Michael Collins, Eamon Cant, Douglas Hyde, Martin Corrie, you probably know the answer already, Dr. Noel Brown, David Trimble, Bram Stoker, Nell McCafferty, Mick Lally, Shauna Fillon, and Peter Jennings, the anchorman for it. So, Tom Barry's father, that's his RAC man. Michael Collins' uncle. Eamon Cant's father was head constable. That's the father there in the centre of that photograph. That's Eamon Duggan's family. Joe McKelvey also. Noel Brown, in his biography, makes no mention of his father being in the RIC, but both grandfathers also were in it. That's, of course, Martin Corrie. Douglas Valder Duff, Roger Caseman's godchild. An amazing, amazing character altogether. He was born in Argentina. That's how a Caseman connection when he was outside there at the time. Jimmy Kennedy, Red Sails in the Sunset, Roll Doors. All his family, his father and several of his uncles were on the RIC and RUC. Shauna Fillon's father. Peter Jennings, I corresponded with him. He died of cancer there in 2005. I found disciplinary records of his great-grandfather fighting in the pub over a woman. And a second one fighting a second time over a woman. And he said, I don't know whether he won or lost, because he said the other fella ended up marrying her. And Douglas Hyde's brother also, John Oldfield Hyde, was the district inspector. Now, Thomas St. George Mccarthy, one of the founders of the GAA, I found him in a pauper's grave above in Dean's Grange with a tree grown up to it. And for the 125th anniversary, we convinced him to put up a memorial to him. Dave Allen's father was an auxiliary. He was involved in the sacking of Trim above there. His father had a fantastic sense of humour. He lost a leg. He used to attribute it to the war, but I think he was born in actually 1900, couldn't have been at the war. But a printing press fell in his leg and he got his leg cut off. But it just shows where he gets his humour. He went to a fancy dress party dressed as a toffee apple. Greer Garson, David Greer, he's her grandfather. Sebastian Barry, he still doesn't know it, but the Steward of Christendom, the play that's based on him. I've got actually the original file. It went with a set of medals, and a person actually posted the file to me only in the last year. And he got several commendations, and one in particular when he was out in Dunleary about organising a case where this guy was flashing above at the window for getting all the witnesses to come to court and give their evidence. So, and that's him in the middle there in 1916, his grandfather. It's a very rare photograph because the DMP were not armed, but they went out, fired a few shots training, and they were told to come back in 1916. That's him there on the left wearing the medals. Mccarthy, great-grandfather David Trimble, Neil Mccarthy, Bram Stoker I mentioned earlier on, his grandfather. William Hill, the bookmaker, got compensation, £3,700. That's how he started up the bookies. He was a tan. He was driving between Middleton and Castlemartyr in a convoy, and there was mines on the road, and he injured his legs. They had a facility at the time for compensation. He also got a pension of £185, so he cashed that in for £1,000, put onto his lump sum. But they had a facility at the time that when they came under fire, where a person would be certified by the RIC surgeon as being incapacitated for a degree more than 3 months he would be out of work, he could apply for a pension on that because he was a candidate automatically to claim against the assizes. And the actual forms that they filled out are online now, but it actually tells you all about the circumstances. That's where I found William Hill stuff. And there's some mention in the paper about the compensation. And Andrew McFarlane, ancestors in the RSC, Sir Edward Carson, my adopted daughter of a county inspector. What was funny about this was that I found out Custer ended up with 2 RIC revolvers. I found out all about the presentation, but they're actually in the Roy Rogers Museum. And I came in, I was all excited about it. I went to the Garda Museum, there's a great wit above in it. He said, just wouldn't you be better off with a pair of runners? The Inspector General of the RIC invented the game of snooker. And the term snooker is the lowest form of army cadet in Woolwich. He invented in India. He just changed the colour of the balls, and so there's a connection with Napoleon Bonaparte also. A county inspector married into the family, so he got drowned. Michael Staine's father was an RIC man. This is the very first guard, the most extraordinary character. I found his grave in Albany, New York, and I put a cap badge on it. He had 2 wives at the same time. He was a friend of Michael Staine's, and that's the reason he ended up being guard number 1. He was in the RIC, went off to First World War. He was in the RIC, the DMP, the Guards, the Irish Army, and the British Army. He ran up some debts, and that was the cause of him taking off. But what he never bargained for is that when he joined the RIC and left, they were amalgamated with the Guards, so he was back into where he started again, so he took off. Now, the person who gave me the first information on this was a guard above him, Granabahar Station, who had no interest in history. But he says to me, there's a geezer, he said, down in a nursing home, and he's telling me his father was the first guard. So I went down to him anyway, and he had this photograph up on the locker. And on the locker was, there was another photograph also of another gentleman with his sister. And he said, but I said, that's Irish Guards uniform, and that's in World War I. So I went back and checked the records. Now, Gregory Allen, the first curator of the Guard, was a very pious man altogether, and he was all for, he knew the story about number 1 disappearing, but number 2 did everything right, kept his mouth shut, kept his head down, got promoted, kept everything perfect, until this guy, his story started appearing. So I asked him, where did the photograph come out of? Well, he said, I know I've been in the war. And I said, I'd love to know. He said, when there's a centenary coming up that we commemorate the first guard, somewhere in New York, he's buried. That's as much I know, he said. So I just come back from the States, and I got a CD-ROM with all the telephone numbers for New York on it. And Rosemary Circle, he said, was the last address we had in Albany. So I typed it in, I came up with a person with the same name, Kerrigan. So I got the number. He rang the number anyway. And he got in contact with a cousin, and he said, your father died in 1946, he said, like that. But he said, you know your half-brother, he said. He's on the locker was a photograph I mentioned of his sister and this other gentleman. This was his half-brother of the second family. So by coincidence, the man in the nursing home had a sister in California. The half-brother was now living in California. So they got a forwarding address, sent it, it arrived in the sorting office. The fellow picked it up, the sorter said, I'm playing golf with the fellow Kerrigan, I think it's the same fellow, put it in his back pocket. He got the letter, he was living within 10 minutes of this man's daughter. So they met up for the first time. And there's one married to a Mexican anyway, and there's not a Hawaiian connection. So the great-grandchildren of the first guard are half Hawaiian triplets. So you just can't choose who your ancestor. I'm actually finished.
We'll reconvene in 5 minutes.